October the 24th, 1942, marked a pivotal moment on Guadalcanal, specifically at Henderson Field, where an impending confrontation loomed. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, shrouded by the dense, oppressive darkness of the jungle, were stealthily advancing toward a solitary battalion of United States Marines who were entrenched along a muddy ridgeline. On paper, the impending engagement seemed destined for a brutal massacre, with the numerical superiority heavily favoring the Japanese at a 3-to-1 ratio. The Japanese forces comprised elite troops, battle-hardened and victorious from their campaigns in China and Malaya, poised against exhausted defenders who had endured 2 months of meager half-rations. Every established military doctrine and textbook unequivocally stated that in close quarters, infantry combat, the decisive advantage shifted to the side possessing a greater number of bayonets. The Japanese High Command could readily deploy 3,000 bayonets, whereas Colonel Chesty Puller commanded a mere 700 Marines. However, concealed within the very mud that protected these Marines were innovative weapons poised to fundamentally redefine all prevailing assumptions about infantry warfare. These were not the formidable heavy machine guns, nor the distant artillery shells fired from miles away, but something entirely different. These were remarkably compact tubes, so light and small that a single soldier could carry one with ease. Their design was elegantly simple, featuring no moving parts beyond the shell itself as it descended the barrel. These were the very weapons that Japanese intelligence had contemptuously dismissed as mere support equipment, barely meriting a mention in their pre-battle assessments. The assault was scheduled to commence in just 4 hours, and in the encroaching darkness, Edgar Brandt, his 19-year-old visionary concept for preserving soldiers' lives was about to collide head-on with Imperial Japan, his millennia-old ethos concerning how soldiers ought to meet their demise. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The genesis of how a French artist ultimately played a crucial role in safeguarding an American airfield traces back 23 years prior, originating in a city entirely unconnected to either nation, Paris, in the year 1919. While the Treaty of Versailles was being meticulously negotiated within opulent gilded halls, Edgar Brandt, then 39 years old, was immersed in his metalwork shop on the Rue de la Fontaine. His daily routine involved supervising the creation of intricate wrought iron gates destined for prestigious embassies and crafting ornamental grillwork intended to adorn the Louvre. In peacetime, Brandt had earned a distinguished reputation as an Art Deco metalsmith, celebrated for his extraordinary ability to manipulate iron, making the unyielding material appear to flow like liquid, fashioning curves and patterns that seemed utterly impossible given its inherent rigidity. Yet, for 4 arduous years leading up to this period, Brandt had not been engaged in creating art. Instead, he had been manufacturing instruments of war. The Great War had imparted upon Brandt a profound lesson, one that most artists never encountered and that many generals stubbornly refused to acknowledge. He had witnessed firsthand French infantrymen perishing by the thousands during devastating attacks across open terrain, mowed down mercilessly before they could even reach German positions. He had observed his homeland sacrifice an entire generation of its young men, primarily because they were unable to provide artillery fire sufficiently close to their own advancing troops without simultaneously endangering their lives. The core issue, Brandt realized, was not a deficiency in courage. French soldiers had died with unwavering bravery. The fundamental problem, he concluded, was one of geometry. Artillery, typically deployed miles behind the front lines, fired shells along flat trajectories. This made it impossible to accurately drop ordnance into enemy trenches without also striking the very men assaulting those trenches. While heavy mortars could launch shells in high, arcing trajectories, allowing them to descend almost vertically, their immense weight, often hundreds of pounds, rendered them impractical for advancing alongside attacking infantry. Machine guns, though capable of moving with the troops, lacked the ability to reach adversaries concealed within trenches and shell holes. A critical void existed, a perilous killing gap between the limited firepower infantry carried and the distant, often unsafe, support artillery could provide. This tragic gap had claimed over 1 million French lives. Brandt, however, perceived this gap through a different lens than military officers. Officers tended to conceptualize solutions within the framework of existing weaponry and how to optimize their deployment. Brandt, in contrast, thought in terms of metal, physics, and the specific functions that various shapes could perform. He was an artist who intuitively grasped that form must always serve function, and an engineer who understood that the most effective design was inherently the simplest. The weapon he envisioned would not supplant traditional artillery. Rather, it would empower every infantry company with its own localized artillery support. It would be compact enough for 2 men to transport, straightforward enough for soldiers to operate without extensive artillery training, and sufficiently accurate to place shells within mere meters of their own forward positions. Crucially, it would be light enough to advance seamlessly with the attacking infantry. His vision materialized as a simple tube, a robust base plate, and a sturdy bipod, nothing more. It eschewed complex breech mechanisms, intricate recoil systems, and sophisticated sighting equipment. Instead, it comprised a smooth steel tube designed to leverage gravity and a propellant charge to propel small shells in high, arcing trajectories. The operation was elegantly simple: drop a shell down the tube, allow the firing pin at the bottom to ignite the propellant, and let the laws of physics do the rest. He christened it a mortar, reviving an ancient term for an ancient weapon. Yet there was nothing archaic about his innovative design. The French Army subjected Brandt's prototype to rigorous testing in 1919, finding its simplicity almost astonishing. It measured 60 millimeters in caliber and weighed a mere 42 pounds in total. A 19-year-old conscript could be proficiently trained to operate it within a single afternoon. It boasted an impressive firing rate of 15 rounds per minute, capable of delivering 3-pound high-explosive shells up to 1,700 meters away. More significantly, its ability to drop shells almost vertically meant it could effectively target enemies in trenches, behind walls, within gullies, or any location where infantry required fire support, but could not safely receive traditional artillery. While its effective radius was modest and its explosive charge moderate, the weapon's paramount advantage was its capacity to accompany infantry wherever they went, a factor that fundamentally altered the dynamics of ground combat. The French Army formally adopted it as the Mortier-Brandt Model 1927, initiated its production, and soon observed other nations, militaries taking keen interest. The United States Army closely observed French military exercises featuring the Brandt mortar in 1931, and immediately grasped its revolutionary potential. American infantry doctrine had been largely shaped by veterans of the Great War, individuals who vividly recalled the devastating consequences of attacking without adequate, close fire support. Consequently, the Army dispatched a specialized team to thoroughly evaluate the weapon. They conducted extensive test firings at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, meticulously disassembled the mortar to examine every component, and precisely measured, weighed, timed, and calculated its performance. Following this exhaustive assessment, they made a decision that would profoundly impact the Pacific War 6 years before its commencement. They acquired the complete production rights. This was not merely a license to manufacture under French supervision, but included comprehensive technical documentation and the unfettered right to modify the design as American industry deemed appropriate. In 1932, the United States Army officially adopted the weapon as the M2 mortar 60 mm. While the designation itself was bureaucratic and easily forgotten, its operational impact would be anything but. American industry, leveraging its renowned efficiency and ingenuity, further simplified Brandt's already straightforward design. The original French version weighed 42 pounds, a weight maintained in the American iteration. However, where the French version could fire 15 rounds per minute, the American version, with a well-trained crew, could achieve 18 rounds per minute. Furthermore, the French version necessitated careful maintenance of its sighting equipment, whereas the American version featured sighting equipment so robust it could endure being dropped from a truck and still retain full functionality. The ingenuity of the American contribution to military technology did not lie solely in its engineering prowess, but rather in its unprecedented capacity for mass production. By the year 1940, the industrial might of the United States had already surpassed France's decade-long output of M2 mortars, manufacturing a greater quantity in a mere fraction of the time. This rapid escalation meant that by 1941, every American rifle company was equipped with a dedicated weapons platoon, which, in turn, housed a mortar section fielding 3 M2 mortars. The ubiquity of these weapons was further cemented by 1942, when the 1st Marine Division disembarked on the shores of Guadalcanal, carrying the mortars as an integral component of their standard issue equipment. Much like their rifles, ammunition, and water supplies. At that juncture, these instruments were merely considered tools, not decisive factors in the impending conflict. Edgar Brandt, the visionary behind the mortar's foundational concept, never had the occasion to visit the distant shores of Guadalcanal, nor did he ever encounter legendary figures such as Chesty Puller or John Basilone, the Marines who would wield his invention in battle. He steadfastly remained in Paris throughout the arduous period of German occupation, diligently safeguarding his workshops. Following the cessation of hostilities, Brandt reverted to his artistic passions, dedicating his talents to crafting intricate, ornamental ironwork for esteemed institutions like museums and government edifices. His passing in 1960 at the age of 79 marked the end of a celebrated artist's life, with his contributions to weaponry often relegated to a mere footnote in his obituaries. Nevertheless, on October 24, 1942, Brandt's nearly 2-decade-old conceptualization of infantry fire support was deeply entrenched in the muddy terrain of a jungle ridgeline, a staggering 7,000 miles from his Parisian home, poised for its ultimate trial against a force of 3,000 adversaries who firmly believed that sheer courage and the sharpness of cold steel could triumph over the overwhelming might of industrial firepower. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The Japanese 17th Army Headquarters, situated in Rabaul, had meticulously orchestrated the October offensive since September, with every detail of their strategy predicated on the assumption that Henderson Field could be seized through a determined infantry assault. Lieutenant General Haruki Hyakutake, commanding a force equivalent to a corps-level deployment across the sprawling Solomon Islands, had forged his distinguished reputation through his exceptional logistical acumen and coordination capabilities, rather than through flashes of tactical brilliance. He was a commander characterized by competence, methodical planning, and an entirely conventional approach to military strategy. When contemplating the challenge presented by Guadalcanal, he perceived a solvable problem, one that could be overcome by deploying a sufficient number of soldiers to attack at the opportune moment and location. American forces on the island were estimated to comprise approximately 10,000 personnel. Intelligence assessments suggested that their defensive positions were sparsely distributed around the perimeter of the airfield. Consequently, the Japanese strategy called for a concentrated assault by elite troops targeting the perceived weakest point, anticipating a decisive breakthrough. This approach was a quintessential example of textbook military doctrine, a strategy that had proven successful in previous campaigns in China and Malaya. There appeared to be no compelling reason to believe it would not yield similar results on Guadalcanal. Hyakutake entrusted the primary assault mission to Major General Masao Maruyama and the 2nd Infantry Division, famously known as the Sendai Division, named after its city of formation. These were not mere garrison troops or recently conscripted, hastily trained recruits. They were seasoned veterans who had distinguished themselves in combat across China and played a pivotal role in the conquest of Singapore. Their officers had received rigorous training at the esteemed Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and their enlisted men had been indoctrinated with the belief that death in battle represented the highest honor a soldier could attain. Maruyama himself embodied the very archetype of leadership most highly prized within Japanese military doctrine, a man of undeniable personal bravery, perpetually willing to lead his troops from the vanguard, and possessing an extraordinary ability to inspire his men to embrace orders that, to an outsider, might appear to be tantamount to suicide missions. He had masterfully guided his division through terrain that the Americans had deemed utterly impassable, navigating the dense jungle under the cloak of night to achieve tactical surprise. His tactical blueprints were aggressive, bordering on the audacious, yet such audacity had delivered victories in the past. The British had once considered Singapore impregnable, only for Maruyama's division to conquer it within 70 days. The operational blueprint for Guadalcanal mirrored the fundamental principles that had secured the triumph at Singapore. It mandated an approach through jungle terrain that the adversary considered impenetrable, followed by a nocturnal attack when the efficacy of American firepower would presumably be diminished. The plan called for striking the most vulnerable point in the perimeter with an overwhelming force, aiming for an immediate breach in the initial rush, and then rapidly exploiting this breakthrough before the American defenders could effectively organize a counter-defense. The core tenets of this strategy were speed, shock, and an unwavering willingness to accept substantial casualties, all believed to be sufficient to overcome any inherent American advantage in terms of firepower. The specific objective was a ridgeline situated to the south of Henderson Field, where Marine positions appeared to be thinly spread. Intelligence reports indicated that this ridge was held by approximately 1 battalion, numbering perhaps 700 to 800 men. Maruyama intended to launch his attack with 3 infantry regiments, comprising more than 6,000 soldiers. The first wave was tasked with breaching the wire obstacles and overrunning the forward defensive positions. The subsequent second wave would then capitalize on this initial breakthrough, pushing relentlessly towards the airfield itself. The ultimate goal was to have Japanese flags proudly flying over Henderson Field by dawn on October 25th, thereby neutralizing American air power in the Solomon Islands. What Japanese intelligence had failed to report, largely due to a fundamental misunderstanding, was the nature of the weaponry carried by those 700 Marines. Reconnaissance teams that had observed the Marine positions had indeed noted machine gun emplacements, rifle positions, and what they perceived to be small artillery pieces. They had meticulously tallied the weapons and estimated their potential firing positions, noting fields of fire and probable avenues of approach. However, they had critically failed to comprehend the true identity of the small, tubular devices positioned behind the Marine lines. Their reports vaguely described these as light support weapons, estimating that they might complicate the assault, but would certainly not impede its ultimate success. Japanese military doctrine crucially possessed no equivalent to the M2 mortar, and what one lacks an equivalent for, one tends to significantly underestimate. The Imperial Japanese Army did employ battalion and regimental mortars, but these were heavy weapons, typically positioned far behind the front lines and operated by specialized artillery crews. The very notion that every rifle company might possess its own mortars, operated by regular infantrymen, and positioned close enough to engage targets within mere meters of friendly troops, lay entirely outside the established Japanese tactical framework. It simply did not conform to their entrenched model of how infantry combat should be conducted. Consequently, this aspect did not feature prominently in their detailed operational planning. The 2nd Division commenced its arduous approach march on October 23rd, navigating through jungles so dense and overgrown that visibility was often limited to a mere 10 meters. Each soldier carried 4 days' worth of rations, a quantity already less than mandated by doctrine, but the maximum they could transport through such challenging terrain. Every man was burdened with his rifle, ammunition, grenades, and essential personal equipment. The division's own mortars and artillery pieces had been deliberately left behind, deemed impossible to move through the jungle quickly enough to maintain the required pace. This was, in its purest essence, an infantry assault. Men armed with rifles, bayonets, and machine guns, advancing with unwavering courage and discipline, and the profound expectation that these inherent qualities alone would prove sufficient for victory. Maruyama, exhibiting an unwavering resolve, personally spearheaded the advance, dictating a relentless tempo and embodying the sheer stamina he expected from every soldier under his command. Their movement through the dense jungle was characterized by an almost eerie quietude, a level of acoustic stealth that would have commanded the respect of even the most seasoned professional military units. When the arduous march necessitated a pause for respite, they would simply halt in their tracks, maintaining absolute silence, refraining from any conversation. Their sustenance consisted of cold, unheated rice, a stark necessity born from the tactical imperative to prevent any telltale fires from betraying their concealed positions. This disciplined modus operandi was not novel to them. They were highly proficient, having executed such maneuvers on previous campaigns. Every individual within the division harbored an unshakable conviction in their impending triumph, a belief deeply rooted in their rigorous training, extensive operational experience, and the fundamental tenets of their military doctrine, all of which unequivocally pointed toward success. By the twilight hours of October 24th, the 2nd Division had successfully navigated the challenging terrain, arriving at their designated assault staging areas, situated approximately 3,000 meters to the south of the marine perimeter. Despite the palpable physical exhaustion etched upon their faces from the grueling march, the men exuded an undeniable readiness for the impending confrontation. Officers meticulously synchronized their timepieces and conducted a final, comprehensive review of the intricate assault blueprint. The coordinated offensive was slated to commence at approximately 2300 hours. The initial wave of companies was tasked with advancing directly into enemy contact, creating vital breaches in the barbed wire defenses using specialized Bangalore torpedoes, and subsequently overrunning the forward positions through fierce bayonet charges. Following closely in succession, the second wave companies would move at carefully calculated intervals, poised to capitalize on any strategic openings or gaps forged by the preceding assault. Rapidity of action was paramount. Any delay or hesitation, they understood, spelled certain doom. Once the relentless assault was unleashed, there would be no cessation of hostilities, no retreat, until they either seized Henderson Field or perished valiantly in the attempt. These were the unequivocal directives that had been issued, and indeed they had always constituted the core of their operational orders. As we delve deeper into this gripping account of military strategy and human resolve, we invite you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this narrative. Your appreciation, expressed through a like and subscription, would be profoundly valued. We also encourage you to share your thoughts by commenting on your origin and perspective regarding the subject matter presented in this video. The ingrained Japanese infantry doctrine fundamentally eschewed the inclusion of contingency plans for potential failure, as the very act of planning for such an outcome implicitly suggested that failure was an acceptable alternative. It was, however, unequivocally unacceptable. The only permissible outcomes were absolute victory or an honorable death, with no conceivable middle ground. What Maruyama and his cadre of officers remained utterly unaware of, and indeed could not possibly have discerned from their concealed jungle positions, was that their meticulously executed approach had already been compromised. At precisely 21:30 hours, Sergeant Ralph Briggs, stationed in a forward observation post, a full 3,000 meters ahead of the main marine lines, detected distinct movements emanating from the jungle's depths. It was not merely isolated rustling, but a significant volume of sound, the telltale auditory signature of thousands of men even when striving for the utmost silence. He patiently listened, his senses keenly attuned, methodically estimating the enemy's strength based on the sustained duration and fluctuating intensity of the discernible noise. Subsequently, he retrieved his field telephone and established urgent communication with Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller's command post. The message he relayed was concise and delivered with professional precision. About 3,000 Japanese between you and me. With his duty discharged, he calmly resecured his position, bracing himself for the inevitable onslaught. Behind him, within the Marine defensive lines, mortarmen immediately sprang into action, meticulously inspecting their equipment and systematically stacking rounds of ammunition in preparation. By October 1942, Lewis Burwell Puller had dedicated a remarkable 24 years of his life to service in the United States Marine Corps. Throughout this extensive tenure, he had cultivated an almost preternatural intuition for anticipating the precise vectors of enemy assaults. He had already ascended to legendary status within the Corps, a formidable figure who had earned 2 distinguished Navy Crosses during his campaigns in Nicaragua, where he relentlessly combated guerrillas across jungle terrains, remarkably akin to the challenging landscape of Guadalcanal. His troops affectionately bestowed upon him the moniker Chesty, a tribute to his robust barrel-chested physique and his characteristic gait, which saw him thrusting his chest forward as if defiantly challenging any adversary to take a shot. His reputation was firmly established as a leader who consistently positioned himself where the fighting raged most fiercely, not out of a thirst for personal glory, but from an innate understanding that effective officers unequivocally led from the very front lines, or they forfeited their right to lead altogether. Consequently, upon receiving Briggs's critical report at 2130, Puller exhibited no hesitation. He neither questioned the numerical estimate nor sought further confirmation. If Sergeant Briggs asserted there were 3,000 enemy combatants, then for Puller the number was irrefutably 3,000. Puller's 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment was responsible for defending approximately 1,000 meters of the southern perimeter. Within the next 4 hours, this particular sector was destined to transform into the most perilous stretch of ground across the entire Pacific theater. Their meticulously prepared defensive position occupied a low ridgeline that traversed roughly from east to west, heavily cloaked in dense jungle vegetation. The natural contours of this terrain were strategically advantageous, effectively channeling any attacking forces into predictable and devastating kill zones. Puller himself had devoted 2 painstaking months to the enhancement of these positions, deploying his weaponry with the exactitude of a commander who profoundly grasped that firepower, when judiciously placed, exponentially amplified its efficacy compared to indiscriminate scattering. His machine guns were precisely sighted to establish intricate interlocking fields of fire that blanketed all probable avenues of approach. Concurrently, his rifle companies were deeply entrenched in fortified positions, complete with overhead cover and unobstructed firing lanes. Furthermore, strategically positioned behind the primary rifle line, at meticulously calculated distances and angles, lay the instrumental weapons destined to pivot the outcome of the impending engagement. These comprised 9 M2 mortars, organized into 3 distinct sections, each comprising 3 tubes. Each individual tube weighed a manageable 42 pounds, rendering the system sufficiently straightforward for even a corporal to competently command a section. Yet, despite their relative simplicity, these weapons possessed enough lethal potency to decisively shatter an infantry assault before it could even breach the protective wire. The M2 mortar had been an integral part of Marine Corps service for a decade. However, Guadalcanal marked the inaugural instance where it would confront the ultimate test against a large-scale, determined enemy offensive. Comparatively, the technical specifications of the M2 mortar were rather unassuming when juxtaposed against conventional artillery pieces. Its projectile, weighing just over 3 pounds, contained approximately half a pound of Composition B explosive. The maximum effective range extended to 1,700 meters, though practical accurate engagement was typically confined to closer to 1,000 meters. A well-drilled crew could achieve an impressive rate of fire of 18 rounds per minute, although sustaining such a rapid tempo for extended periods risked overheating the tube. The lethal radius for troops exposed in the open was estimated at approximately 30 meters, diminishing considerably if the enemy was entrenched or under cover. On paper, these numerical values did not appear particularly formidable. The prospect of deploying 3-pound shells against an estimated 3,000 attacking soldiers seemed akin to bringing a mere pocket knife to a desperate sword fight. However, these seemingly modest specifications entirely overlooked the truly revolutionary aspects of the weapon. Its prowess was not predicated on the sheer magnitude of the explosion, but rather on the precise location of impact and the incredible rapidity with which subsequent explosions could be delivered. The inherent genius of the M2 resided in its elegant simplicity and its unique geometric design. The tube itself was a smooth bore, devoid of rifling, which, while reducing accuracy at extreme ranges, conferred the critical advantages of preventing jams and demanding virtually no maintenance. The firing mechanism was ingeniously simple, a fixed pin situated at the base of the tube. The operator merely dropped the shell, which, upon its descent, struck the pin. This action, in turn, ignited the propellant, launching the projectile. There was no trigger to pull, no breech to meticulously close, and no complex mechanical systems susceptible to failure. The bipod and base plate provided essential stability, while the sighting apparatus was so intuitive that even a minimally trained Marine could be accurately delivering shells on target within mere minutes of setting up the weapon system. Nevertheless, the true, decisive advantage of the M2 mortar lay in its distinctive trajectory. Conventional artillery typically fired its projectiles in relatively flat arcs, a necessity to ensure the shells cleared friendly troop positions situated between the gun and its intended target. In stark contrast, the M2 launched its shells in an almost vertical ascent, with the projectile subsequently descending nearly straight down. This unique flight path endowed the mortar with the critical capability to strike targets in defilade positions, such as trenches, ravines, and the reverse slopes of hills, locations that were entirely inaccessible to artillery fire. More significantly, this high-angle trajectory meant that mortars could be strategically positioned in close proximity behind the front lines and could execute danger-close missions, delivering devastating firepower perilously near friendly forces. An operation that would have been unequivocally suicidal with artillery. The Marine commander, Puller, had judiciously placed his mortar teams approximately 200 meters behind his primary infantry lines. This strategic proximity allowed them an unobstructed view of the surrounding topography, facilitating real-time adjustments to their firing trajectories based on visual observations. Each 3-mortar detachment was overseen by a non-commissioned officer, typically a sergeant or corporal, who dictated the precise aiming and firing sequences of the tubes. The crews themselves comprised youthful Marines, predominantly in their late teens, whose initial training on the M2 mortar had taken place at stateside bases like Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton before their deployment overseas. They were well versed in the intricate manual protocols, calibrating the sight, calculating range through tube angle manipulation, and refining their fire based on the impact point of preceding shells. However, the theoretical understanding of these procedures often diverged significantly from their practical application in actual combat scenarios. And for most of these young men, this night would serve as their grim introduction to firing upon an enemy actively seeking to end their lives. The necessary ordnance was conveniently prepositioned in orderly stacks adjacent to each mortar emplacement. High explosive rounds, equipped with impact fuses, were designed to detonate instantaneously upon striking the ground or any solid obstruction. Each individual shell was meticulously stored within a cylindrical casing, ensuring its dryness and protection from the elements. The crews had diligently spent the entire afternoon meticulously inspecting fuses, carefully wiping down propellant increments, and arranging the ammunition with such precision that they could readily locate specific types by touch, even in the profound darkness. This was far from glamorous work. Rather, it represented the kind of painstaking and often monotonous preparation that critically distinguished units that ultimately persevered from those that perished due to avoidable oversights. Puller himself undertook 2 comprehensive inspections of the mortar positions before nightfall, scrutinizing the fields of fire and confirming that the section commanders thoroughly grasped the overarching operational blueprint. When the inevitable Japanese offensive commenced, the mortars were tasked with unleashing pre-calculated barrages on anticipated enemy staging zones. Should the assault reach the defensive wire, their focus would swiftly pivot to providing direct support for the rifle companies, dropping shells perilously close, within 50 meters, of friendly positions. If the defensive line suffered a breach, they were instructed to maintain a relentless barrage directly into the compromised area until their ammunition reserves were depleted or the Japanese advance finally faltered. There was no contingency plan for retreat, for there was simply no viable location to withdraw to. Henderson Field, a mere 400 meters behind their current line, represented the ultimate strategic prize. If Puller's defensive formation fractured, the airfield would be irretrievably lost, signifying the complete collapse of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. We sincerely hope you are finding this narrative engaging. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. Your support through a like and subscription would be profoundly appreciated. We also invite you to share a comment about your origin and your thoughts on the video's subject matter. The Marines entrenched along the ridge line grasped this dire reality without requiring explicit instruction. Their presence on the island dated back to August 7th, embroiled in a protracted campaign, whose full strategic implications remained largely opaque to most of them, yet they intuitively understood its paramount importance. They were utterly exhausted, suffering from chronic malnutrition, and plagued by the debilitating effects of malaria and dysentery. Their uniforms were literally disintegrating from their bodies, succumbing to the relentless humidity and corrosive tropical climate. Weeks had passed since they had received any correspondence from home, leaving them uncertain if their loved ones even knew their current whereabouts. Nevertheless, they were Marines, a designation that intrinsically meant they would steadfastly defend their positions until a direct order to withdraw was issued, or until death claimed them. Between their beleaguered ranks and an estimated 3,000 advancing Japanese soldiers lay a formidable array of obstacles, tangled barbed wire, strategically placed machine guns, an assortment of rifles, a supply of grenades, and a modest complement of 9 small mortars, each weighing a mere 42 pounds. Within the next 4 hours, they would definitively ascertain whether this meager defense would prove sufficient. The enemy's offensive commenced precisely at 2300 hours, heralded by a flurry of artillery fire emanating from Japanese guns situated several kilometers south of the marine perimeter. The incoming shells were predominantly of smaller caliber, 75 millimeters and below, yet they generated a cacophony that effectively forced Marine personnel to keep their heads lowered, thereby providing cover for the advancing infantry. Puller, a seasoned veteran, immediately recognized the nature of the incoming fire as a preparatory bombardment rather than a sustained, overwhelming barrage. He understood that the Japanese forces on the island simply lacked the necessary artillery assets for a proper, prolonged preparatory assault. This was merely a diversionary clamor designed to mask the movement of their ground troops. He promptly relayed the crucial intelligence to his company commanders, issuing the terse but clear directive, "Stand by, they are coming." Concurrently, within the Japanese assault positions, officers meticulously synchronized their final tactical maneuvers. Captain Jiro Katsumatada commanded the 11th Company of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division, a unit comprising 200 men specifically chosen for this perilous assault due to their unequivocally demonstrated readiness to embrace death. Katsumatada, at 28 years of age, was a dedicated career officer, a distinguished graduate of the Imperial Army Academy, with prior combat experience in China. There, he had assimilated the harsh lesson that genuinely aggressive leadership necessitated personally leading charges. His sword unsheathed and glinting, his men held him in profound reverence because he never demanded any sacrifice from them that he himself was unwilling to make. The mission assigned for this night was deceptively straightforward in its conceptualization, but bordered on the impossible in its execution. His company was designated to spearhead the initial assault wave. Their task was to advance through the dense jungle undergrowth toward the barbed wire perimeter. They were then to breach this formidable wire barrier using specialized Bangalore torpedoes. Following the breach, they would launch a ferocious charge against the Marine positions, armed with bayonets and grenades. Their ultimate objective was to shatter the American line or perish in the attempt. Every man within the company fully comprehended these orders and had stoically accepted their grim implications. Death was not a potentiality to be circumvented, rather it was the anticipated and almost certain outcome. The sole lingering question was whether they would meet their demise after successfully achieving their mission or before its completion. At precisely 2330 hours, the Japanese artillery bombardment abruptly ceased, and the infantry units began their forward movement. They advanced in disciplined company formations, maintaining strict intervals, navigating as quietly as humanly possible through the thick jungle. This natural terrain inadvertently channeled them directly toward the Marine positions, precisely as Puller had presciently anticipated. The leading companies found themselves utterly blind in the profound darkness and amidst the dense vegetation. Their navigation relied on compass bearings, and by faithfully following the officers who led their advance. Every few minutes they would pause, listen intently for any telltale sounds, and then resume their deliberate progress. The Marines were now incredibly close, perhaps 500 meters away, possibly even less. Sound carried in peculiar and deceptive ways within the jungle environment, rendering accurate distance estimation an impossible feat. Katsumatada could distinctly hear the rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the labored breaths of the men surrounding him. He could discern the pungent odor of their sweat and the pervasive, sickly sweet scent of jungle rot that afflicted nearly everyone on the island. He could feel the familiar weight of his sword in his hand and the heavy, inescapable expectation of the cataclysmic events that were about to unfold. At the stroke of midnight, the vanguard of the Japanese troops reached the formidable barbed wire barrier situated at the base of the ridgeline. This wire had been meticulously strung in multiple, overlapping belts, firmly anchored to robust palm logs, and ingeniously reinforced with tin cans filled with pebbles, designed to rattle loudly if disturbed. The Marines had painstakingly constructed this elaborate obstacle over a period exceeding 2 months, adding layer upon layer until it formed a defensive barrier that, in some sections, extended to a depth of 4 meters. Japanese engineers swiftly moved forward, equipped with their Bangalore torpedoes, long metallic tubes packed with powerful explosives. These devices were intended to be pushed underneath the wire and then detonated, thereby blasting a clear pathway through the obstruction. The inaugural explosion reverberated through the night at 00:15 hours, a sharp, concussive crack that momentarily illuminated the surrounding jungle and carved a gap in the wire approximately 2 meters wide. The breach in the defensive perimeter, a mere 2 meters in width, instantly drew a torrent of lethal attention. From their elevated positions along the slope, Marine machine guns erupted, unleashing a relentless torrent of fire. Brilliant crimson tracers arced through the oppressive gloom of the night, painting streaks across the jungle canopy. The auditory assault was absolute, an incessant, percussive din that reverberated powerfully off the rugged ridge line and permeated the dense jungle foliage. The Japanese engineers, who had courageously detonated the Bangalore torpedo to create this vital opening, perished within moments, their lives extinguished before the reverberations of their explosive act had even dissipated. Nevertheless, the crucial passageway was now accessible. Captain Katsumatada, with unwavering resolve, propelled his company forward, charging directly toward this newly formed aperture. His gleaming sword was unsheathed and held aloft, a beacon of leadership, as he bellowed words of encouragement to his troops, his voice barely discernible amidst the deafening crescendo of the machine gun fire. All around him, his soldiers were succumbing, mercilessly mown down by an unseen enemy, their assailants hidden in entrenched positions that remained stubbornly unidentifiable in the murk. The Marine defenders, unable to precisely pinpoint individual targets, were resorting to an indiscriminate barrage, directed at any perceived sound or fleeting movement, essentially firing blindly into the profound darkness. Yet, the sheer multitude of advancing Japanese forces ensured that even such undirected fire found its grim marks, claiming lives with chilling efficiency. Captain Katsumatada, exhibiting remarkable personal courage and speed, successfully traversed the formidable wire barrier, surged through the newly created gap, and commenced his arduous ascent of the steep incline. In his wake, the remainder of his company endured a catastrophic decimation, relentlessly torn apart by the unceasing torrent of machine gun fire. Despite this brutal attrition, a sufficient number of his soldiers managed to penetrate the breach, thereby preserving a critical, albeit fragile, momentum for the ongoing assault. The strategic calculation was clear. If they could only manage to reach the entrenched Marine positions, if they could just narrow the formidable distance enough to engage in the brutal intimacy of bayonet charges and grenade exchanges, the inherent advantages of superior Japanese infantry training in close-quarters combat would undoubtedly tip the scales in their favor. The imperative was simply to bridge the remaining expanse, a daunting 50 meters, then 40 meters, then a mere 30 meters separating them from their objective. It was at this critical juncture that the devastating barrage from the Marine mortars commenced, fundamentally altering the calculus of the battle. Precisely at 20 hours, the inaugural volley of mortar shells descended with terrifying accuracy upon the vulnerable gap in the wire. A concentrated barrage of 9 projectiles impacted the earth within mere seconds of one another, each a 3-pound high-explosive round equipped with an impact fuse designed for instantaneous detonation upon contact. While the resulting explosions were not individually of immense scale, certainly not comparable to the concussive power of heavy artillery shells, their collective effect was utterly devastating due to their impeccable placement. The highly trained mortar crews had meticulously pre-registered this precise location during the daylight hours, calculating the range and deflection with an astonishing precision, down to the very meter. Now, operating with chilling efficiency, they were merely feeding shells into the firing tubes as rapidly as humanly possible, achieving an incredible rate of 18 rounds per minute per tube. This translated to an overwhelming volume of fire, with more than a single shell impacting the target area every 3 seconds from the entire section. Consequently, the designated impact zone was transformed into an unrelenting, chaotic eruption of concussive force, pulverized earth, and lethal shrapnel. Japanese soldiers who had been diligently advancing toward the critical gap were either violently disintegrated by the blasts or forcibly driven to the ground, desperately seeking any semblance of cover. The Bangalore Gap, once the focal point and strategic objective of the entire assault, had been transmuted into an infernal killing zone, an area where survival became an impossibility. As this dramatic account of valor and devastation continues, we implore you to stay with us and witness the gripping conclusion of this narrative. The chroniclers of this history would be deeply grateful for your support through a simple acknowledgement and by becoming a regular subscriber to these tales. Furthermore, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, perhaps noting your own geographical origin and offering your perspective on the profound strategic and human aspects of this pivotal engagement. Captain Katsumatada, by a stroke of both fortune and sheer speed, had already successfully navigated through the perilous gap just moments before the devastating mortar bombardment commenced. However, the vast majority of his men, still struggling to follow his lead, remained tragically exposed on the approach. He cast a desperate glance backward, witnessing with chilling clarity the methodical, precise eruptions of high explosives systematically marching through the remnants of his company, dismembering his unit with brutal efficiency, piece by agonizing piece. Of the original 200 men who had embarked on this audacious assault merely 15 minutes prior, he now found himself with perhaps only 30 surviving soldiers on the Marine side of the wire. Despite this horrific decimation, his unwavering resolve hardened. He resolutely turned his attention back towards the formidable Marine positions and resumed his relentless climb up the treacherous slope. For him, there was no alternative course of action, no possibility of retreat. The paramount objective, the very essence of his command, was to achieve a breakthrough. He would either accomplish this seemingly impossible feat or perish in the valiant attempt. On the opposing Marine defensive line, the indomitable Sergeant John Basilone was at the helm, commanding 2 critical machine gun sections. These formidable emplacements were strategically positioned to deliver overwhelming suppressive fire across the primary avenue of approach, ascending the formidable ridgeline. Under his direct command were 4 Browning M1917 machine guns. Robust Time-2's 30 caliber weapons, distinguished by their water-cooled operating system, a design feature that enabled them to sustain continuous fire for considerably longer durations than their air-cooled counterparts. His dedicated crews, a picture of disciplined efficiency, were relentlessly feeding ammunition belts into these formidable weapons as swiftly as the mechanisms would permit, unleashing controlled, short bursts of fire at any discernible movement in the impenetrable darkness below. Basilone himself moved with practiced urgency between the various gun positions, vigilantly checking for any potential jams, meticulously ensuring that the crucial water jackets were not dangerously overheating, and expertly directing the concentrated fire towards the telltale sounds and fleeting movements that betrayed the enemy's presence. He could distinctly observe the devastating impact of the mortar rounds further down the slope, their brilliant flashes momentarily illuminating the advancing Japanese soldiers, silhouetting them against the explosive light before they vanished once more into the profound obscurity of the night. It was evident that the mortars were performing their designated function with textbook precision, effectively disrupting and fragmenting the enemy assault before it could coalesce into a massed final charge. Nevertheless, a determined few of the Japanese forces continued their relentless advance. He could clearly discern their defiant shouts, and occasionally individual figures were momentarily silhouetted against the blinding mortar flashes, relentlessly scaling the slope towards his position, their bayonets ominously fixed. A short distance behind Sergeant Basilone's forward position, Second Lieutenant Joseph Turzi exercised command over the vital weapons platoon attached to K Company of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. His complement of 3 M2 mortars had been engaged in a continuous barrage since the critical hour of 0020, and their relentless bombardment was slated to persist until either the Japanese offensive completely ceased, or their substantial ammunition reserves were entirely expended. His dedicated crews, having overcome any initial trepidation, were now operating with a synchronized, almost mechanical rhythm, their movements honed by the crucible of repetition and the urgent demands of battle. The established procedure was executed flawlessly. Suspend the shell precisely over the tube, release it to drop, await the resounding discharge, make any necessary minor adjustments, and then immediately commence the cycle anew. The mortar tubes themselves were indeed growing noticeably hot from the sustained rate of fire, yet they remained within safe operational limits, far from any dangerous overheating. Crucially, they were well supplied with an abundant quantity of ammunition, and each projectile they dispatched into the inky blackness found its mark on unseen targets below, systematically annihilating enemy soldiers who, in their wildest imaginings, could never have conceived of such a devastating and invisible threat. Against all odds, Captain Katsumatada, displaying an almost supernatural resilience, finally reached the formidable marine wire, with a mere 23 men from his original contingent still alive and struggling in his wake. The overwhelming majority of his 200-man company lay tragically scattered across the unforgiving slope below, a grim tableau of dead, gravely wounded, or utterly pinned down by an inescapable barrage of enemy fire. In a final desperate act of defiance, he gripped his ceremonial sword firmly in one hand while clutching a live grenade in the other. The Marine positions loomed just 10 meters directly ahead. Formidable defensive emplacements meticulously dug into the ridgeline, engineered with overlapping and interlocking fields of fire that rendered any further advance a prospect bordering on the suicidal. Yet, in his mind, nearly suicidal was not an absolute equivalent to impossible. Captain Katsumatada had, by sheer force of will, endured too much and come too far to falter or cease his advance now. With a guttural roar, he hurled the grenade toward the closest machine gun position, patiently endured the brief, tense moment awaiting its concussive explosion, and then, without hesitation, surged forward, his voice hoarse with fervent encouragement to his few remaining men. A handful of these brave, desperate souls attempted to follow his lead. However, the merciless marine fire ensured that the vast majority of them failed to advance even 3 steps before being cut down. The formidable Browning machine gun, which Captain Katsumatada had so audaciously targeted with his grenade, had indeed sustained damage from the blast, yet it remained, crucially, far from being destroyed. Its resilient crew, having instinctively sought cover during the momentary chaos of the explosion, now swiftly returned to their battle-hardened weapon. The vigilant gunner, perceiving a flicker of movement amidst the lingering smoke and darkness, expertly traversed the barrel of his weapon and unleashed a precise, devastating burst of fire that unequivocally struck Katsumatada in both the chest and the throat. The valiant Japanese captain collapsed instantly, his sword still clutched firmly in his lifeless hand, expiring before he could even register the fatal impact that had claimed his life. The few men who had managed to follow him continued their desperate, futile advance for a mere handful of seconds longer, until the relentless and accurate marine rifle fire systematically cut them down, one by one. By precisely 0035 hours, every single man from Captain Katsumatada's company, who had managed to reach the immediate vicinity of the marine wire, lay dead. The determined assault, which had been meticulously planned and executed with the express objective of breaching Colonel Puller's formidable defensive line, had been definitively halted a mere 15 meters short of the forwardmost positions. However, the Japanese offensive, despite the catastrophic failure of Katsumatada's company, was by no means concluded. General Yumio Nasu, commanding the formidable 29th Infantry Regiment, initiated a renewed and concerted attack from the south. His disciplined troops were now actively engaging the defensive wire at numerous points along Colonel Puller's extended front. These were demonstrably not the frenzied, often suicidal, Banzai charges that characterized some earlier engagements. Rather, they represented meticulously coordinated company-level assaults executed by highly professional soldiers, individuals who possessed a profound understanding of modern infantry tactics, including the intricate principles of fire and movement, and the effective methodologies for suppressing entrenched defensive positions. They skillfully exploited the natural contours of the terrain, advancing with calculated precision through draws and gullies that afforded them a measure of vital cover from direct enemy fire. Furthermore, they brought their own formidable machine guns forward, employing them with tactical acumen to suppress the Marine positions, thereby enabling their assault troops to close the distance with greater impunity. Their capabilities were undeniable, their training exemplary. Yet they were inexorably advancing into a meticulously conceived defense, a defensive system crafted by a man, Colonel Puller, who had dedicated an astonishing 24 years of his life to the precise and efficient art of killing. And crucially, this formidable defense was further bolstered by an array of support weapons whose devastating capabilities and tactical deployment had simply never been accounted for within the established parameters of their own military doctrine. As the fierce engagement intensified, the M2 mortars dynamically shifted their concentrated fire, systematically walking their destructive shells along the base of the ridge wherever Japanese troops were observed to be gathering in significant numbers. Despite the profound darkness of the night, the mortar section commanders were not reliant on direct visual contact with their targets. Instead, the keen-eyed machine gunners and vigilant riflemen positioned on the forward defensive line possessed a precise understanding of the enemy's assembly points, relaying this critical intelligence back through a rapid series of shouted ranges and directional commands. The dedicated mortar crews, acting swiftly on this vital information, meticulously adjusted their trajectories, dropping high explosive ordnance as close as 50 meters in front of friendly positions, and occasionally even closer. This aggressive tactic constituted danger close fire by any conceivable military benchmark, presenting an inherent risk that a misdirected round could tragically claim Marine lives. However, Colonel Puller had rigorously trained his men to stoically accept such calculated risks, understanding that the only alternative was the catastrophic possibility of being completely overrun. Consequently, the mortars maintained a relentless, methodical barrage, forging an impassable zone of utter destruction that stretched from the marine wire entanglements down the perilous slope and deep into the jungle, where Japanese reserves were haphazardly attempting to advance. At the precise juncture of 00-100 hours, General Nasu unleashed a formidable second wave of companies, dispatching another 1,000 men forward with the explicit directive to exploit any perceived breaches or vulnerabilities that the initial assault might have managed to create. Yet the grim reality revealed no such openings. The battlefield was instead strewn with only fallen and wounded soldiers, alongside a few isolated groups that had indeed penetrated the wire, only to be swiftly neutralized by concentrated rifle fire before they could capitalize on their fleeting success. The second equally determined wave advanced directly into the unrelenting, devastating fusillade of machine gun fire and the pulverizing mortar barrages that had already decimated their predecessors. While undoubtedly brave and impeccably disciplined, these soldiers were completely unable to surmount the fundamental, unyielding mathematics of the tactical situation. They were compelled to attack uphill through formidable defensive impediments against defenders who possessed the distinct advantage of seeing them starkly silhouetted against the stark, intermittent flashes of exploding mortar rounds, and who wielded an unexpectedly superior volume of firepower, far exceeding what Japanese intelligence had previously believed possible. In this brutal equation, sheer courage proved woefully insufficient. Unwavering discipline, similarly, could not alter the outcome. Even the profound, ultimate will to die for their emperor was, tragically, not enough. We ask you to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. General Nasu himself personally advanced with his command group, valiantly striving to maintain some semblance of control over a battle that was rapidly disintegrating into an escalating pandemonium. He could distinctly hear the intense cacophony of machine gun fire and the deafening explosions. Yet he lacked crucial visual confirmation regarding the actual fate of his beleaguered units. Vital communications had collapsed almost immediately upon the commencement of the assault. Runners dispatched to the forward positions failed to return, their fates unknown. He had already committed more than half of his regiment, and to his growing dismay, as far as he could discern, they had achieved absolutely nothing. The Marine defensive line was, according to his operational plan, supposed to have fractured by this point. His valiant troops were supposed to be relentlessly advancing toward Henderson Field. Instead, they were tragically perishing in the lethal wire entanglements and within the unforgiving kill zones beyond, annihilated by omnipresent, annihilating weaponry that seemed to erupt from every direction simultaneously. At the precise moment of 01:30 hours, a Marine mortar shell made a devastating impact, landing directly upon Nasu's forward command post. The general sustained critical injuries, struck by shrapnel in both his chest and abdomen. He would succumb to these grievous wounds sometime within the ensuing few hours, though historical accounts unfortunately disagree on whether his death was instantaneous or if he lingered until the following day. Regardless, his demise irrevocably severed the strategic coherence and effectively ended coordinated Japanese command of the entire southern assault. In the absence of central command and guidance, the Japanese attacks continued, but they became increasingly fragmented and chaotic. Individual company commanders, adhering to the rigid tenets of Japanese military doctrine, which prohibited autonomous tactical retreats, unflinchingly continued leading their men forward. They were compelled to attack the very same positions that had already repulsed multiple desperate assaults. They met their end in the very same fatal wire entanglements that had claimed the lives of their comrades. By 0200 hours, the grand assault had devolved into a mosaic of disparate, isolated company actions. Each successive unit was met with relentless and systematic annihilation, destroyed in turn by the consistent, unyielding deluge of machine gun fire and mortar barrages that had already decimated all previous attempts. The Marines were not securing victory through a mere exhibition of superior courage or inherently better training, though these were undoubtedly present. Their triumph was, instead, fundamentally determined by their overwhelming, judiciously deployed offensive might, meticulously positioned and expertly employed. Every single Japanese soldier who managed to reach the defensive wire was instantly neutralized before they could even contemplate breaching the formidable defenses. Similarly, every Japanese unit that attempted to mass for a coordinated assault was shattered and dispersed by the accurate mortar fire before it could achieve any semblance of tactical cohesion. The ingenious weapon that Edgar Brandt had conceived and designed in Paris some 23 years prior was performing exactly as he had intended. It was effectively preserving friendly infantry by preemptively neutralizing enemy infantry before they could close to hand-to-hand combat range. At Oro 300 hours, a crucial directive was issued to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, ordering him to move his 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, forward to reinforce Colonel Puller's beleaguered position. Hall commanded Army troops, comprising soldiers from the North Dakota and South Dakota National Guard, who had indeed trained alongside Marines, but who had until this very night been hitherto untested in actual combat. A lingering skepticism had existed among some Marines regarding whether these National Guard troops possessed the fortitude to withstand a real, brutal fight. Hall's battalion was now poised to deliver a definitive answer to that very question. They stealthily advanced under the cloak of darkness, carrying their own M2 mortars and a substantial supply of ammunition, strategically augmenting Puller's defensive flanks. The Japanese forces would subject them to an imminent and rigorous trial within the hour. General Maruyama, who was commanding the 2nd Division from his distant command post several kilometers to the south, possessed only scant and unreliable intelligence regarding the catastrophic events unfolding for his assault troops. He was aware that the attack had commenced, and he understood that casualties were mounting heavily. However, he remained profoundly unaware that his ambitious assault had already definitively failed. Japanese military doctrine, characterized by its unyielding adherence to military tenets, mandated the unceasing prosecution of offensive operations until either success was unequivocally achieved or the unit was utterly destroyed. Acting on this doctrine, he dispatched orders forward, committing his last reserve regiment to the already doomed assault. These orders eventually reached disparate unit leaders, scattered company commanders, who, in turn, continued leading their men forward into the relentless deluge of machine gun fire and mortar barrages that never seemed to slacken. By Oro 400 hours, the 2nd Division had suffered a devastating toll of more than 2,000 casualties and had achieved an almost insignificant penetration, advancing no more than 30 meters beyond the wire at any point along Puller's meticulously defended front. The assault would tragically continue for several more grueling hours, but its ultimate outcome had already been incontrovertibly determined. Edgar Brandt's revolutionary weapon had fundamentally altered the landscape of infantry warfare, and 3,000 Japanese soldiers had discovered that profound, transformative influence in the most brutally undeniable lesson imaginable.